Galactic Empire declared war. The human-woman general only grinned. Is that all? The alarm on my console screamed, before I even understood what it meant. I am Vexthal, an intelligence officer of the Karathi Empire, and in that moment my hands were shaking over the controls of a ship that had never once lost a battle. We had just delivered a formal declaration of war to a species called humanity, and I expected the usual response. Fear, pleading, maybe a desperate offer of surrender before the first shot was even fired. That is what happened every single time we sent this message to a lesser civilization. It was routine, it was almost boring. But nothing about what followed was routine. The transmission connected to a single human officer, standing in a plain metal room with no decorations, no flags, no grand chairs of power behind her. She wore a simple gray uniform with no medals on her chest, and her hair was tied back in a way that suggested she had somewhere else to be. She looked at the screen the way someone looks at a delivery they did not order, bored, mildly inconvenienced. Her name, according to our translated files, was General Lena Cole. I remember the silence in our command bridge as she read our ultimatum. Our ambassador, a proud and ancient being named Sjar Vok, had spent 3 full minutes listing the might of the Karathi Empire. He spoke of 17 conquered species. He spoke of 1,000 years of unbroken dominance across the stars. He spoke of fleets so vast they blotted out suns. He finished by demanding total surrender within 1 full rotation of her home planet, or face complete destruction. General Cole blinked once. Then she asked him to repeat the last part, because she admitted, quite plainly, that she had not been listening. I have studied diplomacy for over 400 cycles. I have seen kings weep. I have seen entire councils fall to their knees. I had never seen anyone ask an empire to repeat its own declaration of war because they were distracted. Sjar Vok's voice cracked with fury as he repeated himself, louder this time, his neck frills flaring in a show of dominance that had ended civilizations before. General Cole nodded slowly, tapped something on a small device in her hand, glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked back up at the screen. She smiled. It was not a smile of fear disguised as courage. It was not the tight, controlled smile of someone trying to hide panic. It was easy, relaxed, the kind of smile you give an old friend who just told a joke you already knew the punchline to. Is that all? She said. The bridge went completely silent. I looked around at my crewmates, expecting someone to explain what I was missing, some hidden meaning behind her words, that only a more experienced officer would understand. But every face mirrored my own confusion. Sjar Vok's mouth opened and closed twice, before he managed to speak again. You dare mock the Karathi Empire, he demanded. I'm not mocking anything, General Cole replied, and her voice was calm, almost gentle. I just want to make sure I have the full picture, before I go tell my people we're at war. Is there anything else, or was that the whole speech? Sjar Vok's frills turned a shade of deep purple I had only ever seen during moments of extreme rage. He terminated the transmission himself, something I had never once seen him do. Usually, we cut the connection after the enemy had properly groveled. This time, we cut it because he could not stand to look at her smile for 1 more second. I was ordered to compile a full threat assessment on humanity within the hour. This was standard procedure. Before any declared war, our analysts would spend weeks studying an enemy's fleet capacity, resource production, population centers, and morale patterns. But we had already sent the declaration before I had finished my report, because Sjar Vok insisted humanity posed no real threat. Their sensor signatures were faint. Their ships appeared old and slow, according to the scans we had gathered from the border. Our projections gave them less than a 4% chance of surviving first contact with even a fraction of our main fleet. I remember writing in my notes that something about those numbers did not sit right with me. A species that calm in the face of total annihilation either did not understand the threat or understood something about themselves that we did not. I brought my concerns to Fleet Commander Draxil Thorne, a towering Karathi officer whose scales bore the marks of 40 successful campaigns. He listened to me for exactly as long as it took him to finish his drink, then waved a clawed hand dismissively. Every species grins before they understand, he said. It is the last thing they do before the fear sets in. Do not mistake ignorance for confidence, Vexthal. I wanted to believe him. He had more battle experience than I had years of life. But something about the way General Cole had looked into that screen stayed with me. She had not looked at us like a predator sizing up prey, nor like prey trying to appear larger than it was. She had looked at us the way a teacher looks at a student who just asked a question they had already answered 100 times before. Over the following hours, our fleet began preparations for what Commander Thorne called a demonstration strike. The plan was simple and had worked countless times before. We would send our vanguard fleet, 500 warships strong, to a lightly defended human colony near the border. We would disable their defenses, take their leaders into custody, and broadcast the surrender across every human network we could access. It was meant to end the war before it truly began, breaking their spirit before they had time to organize any real resistance. I asked to review the sensor data on the target colony one more time before the fleet departed.
Something about the readings bothered me.
Human ships near the colony showed almost no weapon signatures. Their shield generators appeared weak, barely strong enough to stop debris. Their communication chatter, what little we could intercept, was calm and orderly, filled with routine phrases about supply schedules and maintenance checks. Not a single panicked message, not one plea for reinforcements. Either they had not yet realized war had been declared, or they simply did not care. I brought this observation to Commander Thorne as well, and this time he actually paused to consider it. He asked me what I believed it meant. I told him honestly that I did not know, but that a species preparing to lose everything should show some sign of distress, and humanity showed none. He nodded slowly, then ordered the fleet to proceed regardless, citing that hesitation before an enemy, however strange, was still a weakness we could exploit. I watched from the observation deck as our 500 ships assembled into formation, their hulls gleaming under the light of a distant star. It was an impressive sight, the kind that had ended wars before they started, for a dozen different species. I remember feeling a strange mixture of pride and unease as the fleet prepared to jump toward human space. Before departure, I managed to pull one more file from our archives, a set of old records from a scouting mission decades earlier that had briefly observed human military drills from a great distance. The footage was grainy and incomplete, but something in it caught my attention. The humans in the recording moved with an unsettling kind of coordination, not the rigid formations of a species following strict programming, but something far more fluid, almost instinctive, like they had been solving problems of survival long before they ever built a single starship. I did not have time to analyze it further before the order came to begin the jump sequence. As the stars outside my viewport began to stretch and blur, I found myself thinking about General Cole's smile one more time. "Is that all?" she had asked, as if our entire empire, our 17 conquered worlds, our 1,000 years of dominance, amounted to nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her day. I did not sleep during the jump. I kept reviewing the old scouting footage over and over, trying to understand what I had missed. Around me, the crew prepared for what they believed would be an easy victory, filling the ship with the low hum of confident chatter and the clatter of weapons being checked one final time. I envied their certainty. I wished I could share it. As our fleet emerged from the jump corridor, the human colony came into view on our main display, a small cluster of structures orbiting a quiet blue planet. No alarms sounded, no defense platforms activated. It looked, for all purposes, like an ordinary peaceful settlement, entirely unaware that 500 warships had just arrived to bring it to its knees. Commander Thorne gave the order to begin the approach, his voice steady and full of the same confidence that had carried him through 40 campaigns. I stood at my station, watching the numbers on my screen, waiting for the first signs of panic to appear among the human ships. They never came. Instead, something strange happened to our own sensors. A soft, almost musical tone began pulsing through the ship's systems, so faint I almost missed it beneath the noise of the bridge. I looked down at my console and watched as line after line of data began to shift, numbers rearranging themselves in patterns I did not recognize. I remember turning to the officer beside me to ask if she was seeing the same thing, and that is the last clear memory I have before everything on our command display went completely dark. When the lights returned a few seconds later, half of our fleet's status reports had turned red, not damaged, not destroyed, simply gone, as if they had never been part of our formation at all. Commander Thorne's voice rose in confusion, demanding answers from every station on the bridge, but no one had any to give him. I looked back at the sensor feed showing the human colony, still calm, still quiet, its structures gleaming peacefully under the light of its sun. And somewhere among those quiet structures, I imagined General Lena Cole, sitting at her plain metal desk, glancing at whatever small device she had checked before asking us if that was truly all we had brought to her doorstep. I did not know it then, but that single moment marked the true beginning of the war, the moment we stopped being the ones asking questions and became, for the very first time, the ones desperately searching for answers. The bridge around me had turned from confident chatter into a storm of confused voices. Officers were shouting over one another, demanding status reports that no one could give. Commander Thorne stood at the center of it all, his claws gripping the edge of his console so tightly I feared it might crack under the pressure. His scales, usually a deep, confident green, had shifted toward a dull gray, a color I had only ever seen described in old texts as a Karathi sign of genuine fear. I forced myself to focus on my own screen, trying to make sense of what little data remained. 250 of our 500 ships had vanished from our formation entirely, not destroyed in the traditional sense, with wreckage and distress signals scattering across space. Simply gone, their signatures erased from our sensors, as if they had never existed. The remaining ships showed critical system failures across the board. Weapons offline, shields collapsed, engines unresponsive. Not a single human ship had fired a visible shot. I ran the numbers again, certain I had made some kind of error, but the results stayed the same no matter how many times I checked them. Our entire Vanguard fleet, the pride of the Karathi military, had been rendered helpless in under 10 seconds, without a single explosion, without a single visible weapon discharge, without any warning at all. Commander Thorne demanded a channel be opened to the human colony, his voice thick with a fury I could tell was masking something closer to disbelief. When the connection finally went through, it was not General Cole who answered. Instead, a young human technician appeared on the screen, sitting casually in what looked like a small control room, a cup of a steaming beverage in her hand. Her name tag read Grace Bennett. She looked at our battered fleet on her own display, tilted her head slightly, and then looked directly into the camera with an expression that was somehow both apologetic and completely unbothered. "Sorry about that," she said, taking a small sip from her cup. "You caught us during a system test. Bad timing on your part, honestly." Commander Thorne's voice came out as a low growl. "You will explain what you have done to my fleet immediately." Grace Bennett shrugged, setting her cup down on the console beside her. "Nothing permanent, if that's what you're worried about. We just borrowed control of a few of your ship systems for a moment. You'll get most of it back once General Cole decides what she wants to do with you." I remember staring at that screen, trying to understand how a single technician, speaking so casually about disabling half an empire's fleet, could sound so completely unimpressed with what she had just accomplished. It was not arrogance in her voice. It was something closer to routine, the same tone someone might use after fixing a minor problem at their workplace. Commander Thorne ordered our remaining ships to open fire immediately, refusing to wait for further explanation. I watched as our weapons systems attempted to charge, only to sputter and fail across nearly every functioning vessel. Grace Bennett watched this happen on her own screen and let out a small, almost sympathetic laugh. "You really don't want to do that," she said. "Not until we give it back to you anyway." The transmission cut out on her end this time, not ours. Commander Thorne stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty screen where her face had been. I could see the muscles along his jaw tightening, the first genuine sign of uncertainty I had ever witnessed from him. Over the following hour, our surviving ships drifted helplessly in human space, unable to fire, unable to properly maneuver, unable to even establish a stable connection back to Karathi command. I spent that hour combing through every scrap of data we still had access to, desperately trying to understand what kind of technology could disable an entire fleet without a single visible weapon. I found nothing in our records that matched what had happened. No known Karathi countermeasure could explain it. No enemy technology we had ever encountered across 1,000 years of conquest came close to this kind of precise, silent, overwhelming control. Eventually, 3 of our smaller support ships began drifting toward the human colony on their own, their engines reactivating without any input from their own crews. I watched in stunned silence as they were guided, almost gently, into a docking formation near one of the colony's smaller stations, like pieces being moved across a board by an invisible hand. Commander Thorne ordered every remaining officer to prepare for what he called an honorable stand, insisting that we would not simply allow ourselves to be captured without resistance. I did not have the heart to tell him that resistance seemed to no longer be something within our control. It was during this tense standoff that I first learned we would soon be given the chance to speak directly with one of the humans who had been aboard our captured support ships, though at the time none of us understood how that conversation would change everything I believed about the war we had just started. For now, all I could do was watch our proud fleet drift silently in the dark, waiting for whatever General Lena Cole decided to do next, her earlier words echoing over and over in my mind. "Is that all?" I finally understood, with a growing dread I could not shake, that we had walked into something far larger than any of us had prepared for, and the true nightmare for our empire had only just begun. I was taken from my ship under guard, though the guards themselves were unlike anything I expected from a species preparing for total war. They did not shout orders or push me forward with weapons drawn. A single human soldier, calm and quiet, simply asked me to follow him, as though I were a guest, arriving late to a meeting, rather than an enemy officer captured in the middle of a failed invasion. The corridors of the human station were plain, almost disappointingly so. No grand displays of power, no trophies from past victories, no symbols meant to remind visitors of human strength. Just clean metal walls, soft lighting, and the quiet hum of machinery doing its work without any need for announcement. I was led into a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. Sitting on one side, waiting for me, was the technician I had seen earlier on our bridge display, Grace Bennett. She had traded her steaming beverage for a small tablet, which she set aside as I entered, gesturing casually for me to take the seat across from her. "You're the one who kept flagging our colony as suspicious before the attack," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. "I read your reports. Good instincts." I did not know how to respond. Somehow, this human technician had already reviewed intelligence reports meant only for Karathi Command, reports I had submitted only hours earlier. I asked her how that was possible. She smiled, the same easy, unbothered smile I had seen from General Cole. "We had access to most of your fleet's internal systems the moment you entered our sensor range. Reading your files wasn't exactly difficult." I sat in stunned silence for a long moment, trying to process what she had just admitted so casually. An entire empire's supposedly secure military network, breached without any apparent effort, by a species we had believed to be barely capable of basic space travel. "Why declare war on us?" I finally asked. "If you knew this would happen, why not simply avoid provoking an empire strong enough to erase 17 worlds?" Grace Bennett leaned back in her chair, considering the question with more seriousness than I expected. "We didn't provoke you. Your ambassador showed up uninvited and threatened to destroy everything we've built unless we surrendered within a single day. What exactly did you expect us to do? Apologize for existing?" Her tone was not angry. If anything, she sounded faintly amused, the way someone might sound recalling a strange misunderstanding, rather than the opening moments of an interstellar war. I told her that every other species we had approached in this manner had ultimately surrendered, understanding the impossible odds against them. "That's the thing," she said. "You've only ever fought species that grew up peaceful, or isolated, or lucky enough to never really need a proper reason to get good at conflict. We didn't have that luxury. Humanity spent thousands of years fighting itself, long before we ever looked up at the stars. We got very, very good at solving problems where someone else was actively trying to stop us." I asked her what she meant by this, and she seemed to consider her words carefully before answering, as though trying to explain something obvious to her that clearly was not obvious to me. "For most of our history, humans fought over land, resources, ideas, pride, all sorts of reasons that probably sound small to a species with an empire spanning half a galaxy, but that meant we spent centuries developing every possible way to gain an advantage over an opponent who was just as clever as we were. Strategy, deception, adaptation, technology built specifically to counter other technology, built specifically to counter that. By the time we finally stopped fighting each other and looked outward, we'd already solved most of the problems your empire has never had to face, because you never had a rival smart enough to force you to. I sat with that explanation for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I asked her, somewhat desperately, why humanity had chosen to keep such capabilities hidden, rather than announcing their strength to the wider galaxy and avoiding conflicts like this one entirely. Grace Bennett shrugged again, an almost apologetic gesture. Would you have believed us if we told you, or would you have assumed we were bluffing, the same way your ambassador assumed our calm reaction meant we didn't understand the threat you posed? I had no answer for her, because I already knew, deep down, that she was right. We would never have believed a peaceful-sounding warning from a species we considered beneath us. We needed to see it for ourselves, and now, drifting helplessly in human space, with half our fleet disabled, we finally had. She asked me, almost gently, what I hoped to gain by continuing this conversation, and I admitted honestly that I simply wanted to understand what kind of enemy we had actually chosen to fight. She nodded slowly, seeming to appreciate the honesty, and pulled her tablet back toward her. You didn't choose to fight an enemy, she said quietly. You chose to fight a lesson, and lessons like this one tend to be remembered for a very long time. Before I could ask her to explain further, a soft chime sounded from her tablet, and her expression shifted into something more focused. She stood, thanked me for my patience, and informed me that General Cole had requested updated reports from the colony's defense systems. As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at me one final time. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think this needed to happen. None of us wanted a war, but once you sent that ultimatum, the decision stopped being ours to make. It became a matter of making sure it never happens again, to us or to anyone else you decide to threaten next. She left the room, and I sat alone for a long while, turning her words over and over in my mind. I had come to this station believing we were the ones holding all the power, the ones capable of erasing entire civilizations with a simple declaration. Instead, I found myself surrounded by a species that had quietly prepared for centuries, waiting patiently for a threat large enough to finally justify showing what they were truly capable of. I thought back to the old scouting footage I had reviewed before the fleet's departure, the strange, fluid coordination of human military drills that none of our analysts had properly understood. It was not the movement of a species programmed for simple obedience. It was the movement of a species that had spent countless generations solving the exact problem we had just presented them with, an enemy determined to destroy them without warning or mercy. Later that day, I was brought additional records from our remaining fleet, detailing the full scope of what had happened during the failed invasion. Every disabled ship reported the same strange pattern: systems taken over with surgical precision, weapons rendered useless before a single shot could be fired, engines guided gently rather than forcibly toward human control. Not a single Karathi life had been lost in the entire encounter. I found this fact more unsettling than if we had suffered heavy losses. An empire that had spent centuries teaching client species the cost of defiance through overwhelming destruction had just been met with an opponent who chose restraint instead, disabling rather than destroying, controlling rather than annihilating. It felt less like a battle and more like a demonstration, a quiet and deliberate message meant to be understood rather than simply survived. I spent the following hours reviewing everything we had gathered about humanity's history, searching for any pattern that might explain their calm confidence in the face of what should have been an unwinnable war. The deeper I searched, the more I began to understand what Grace Bennett had meant. This was not a species that had grown soft through peace and isolation. This was a species shaped entirely by conflict, refined over thousands of years into something our empire, for all its size and age, had simply never encountered before. As I prepared my updated report for whatever remained of Karathi Command, I found myself dreading the moment I would have to explain what I had learned. Not because I feared punishment for delivering bad news, though that fear was certainly present, but because I understood now that the numbers we had relied on, the confident 4% survival projection that had sent 500 ships into human space without hesitation, had been wrong in a way that threatened far more than a single failed invasion. We had not simply misjudged an enemy's strength. We had misjudged the very nature of what we were dealing with, and I feared that mistake would cost our empire far more than anyone currently understood. 3 days passed before Karathi Command finally responded to my report, and when they did, it was not with the outrage I expected, but with a demand for more information. Grand Marshal Kesik Vor, the highest-ranking officer in our entire fleet, requested a direct channel to General Cole herself, insisting that whatever had occurred was simply a misunderstanding that could still be resolved through proper diplomatic channels. I was present in the makeshift command room aboard our remaining ships when the connection was finally established. General Cole appeared on the screen, seated in the same plain office as before, though this time a small stack of files sat neatly beside her, and she glanced at them briefly before giving the Grand Marshal her full attention. Grand Marshal Vor began with practiced formality, expressing what he called deep concern over the unfortunate incident involving our vanguard fleet, suggesting that perhaps both sides had acted hastily and that a proper peace could still be negotiated before matters escalated any further. General Cole listened patiently, nodding occasionally, until he finished speaking. Then she leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the desk in front of her. "I appreciate you reaching out," she said, her tone calm and measured. "But let's be clear about something first. Your ambassador arrived at my border and threatened to erase everything we've built unless we surrendered within a day. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a threat. I responded to a threat. If you're looking for an apology, you're going to be waiting a long time." The Grand Marshal's composure faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, insisting that the Karathi Empire had simply followed standard procedure, used successfully against 17 other civilizations throughout its long history. "That's the problem," General Cole replied. "You've been doing the same thing for 1,000 years, because it kept working. Nobody ever pushed back hard enough to make you reconsider it. I'm not interested in being civilization number 18 on that list." I watched the exchange with growing unease, understanding now that this was not simply a negotiation between two military leaders, but a conversation between two entirely different philosophies of power. Our empire had built its dominance on the assumption that overwhelming force, demonstrated early and decisively, would always be enough to secure obedience. Humanity, it seemed, had built its own strength on refusing to accept that assumption at all. Grand Marshal Vor asked what terms would be necessary to end hostilities immediately, clearly hoping to salvage what remained of our position without further losses. General Cole considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Withdraw every ship from our border systems. Release any records you've gathered on our territory during your scouting missions. And going forward, if you want to talk to us, you send a proper diplomat with a proper offer, not an ultimatum backed by a fleet meant to intimidate us into silence. Do that, and we can talk about what comes next." It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily generous offer given the circumstances. We had lost half a fleet without inflicting a single casualty in return, and instead of demanding total surrender or crushing tribute, General Cole was simply asking us to leave and communicate properly in the future. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and confusion at her restraint. Grand Marshal Vor, however, heard something different in her words. He heard weakness disguised as mercy, a chance to recover our pride without further embarrassment. He informed her that the Karathi Empire would consider her offer, but that he could not guarantee the full council would accept terms dictated by a species that had, in his words, gotten fortunate during a single skirmish. General Cole's expression did not change, though something in her eyes grew noticeably colder. "That's your choice to make," she said simply. "Just understand that what happened to your vanguard fleet wasn't luck. It was restraint. I'd think carefully about what happens if you decide restraint isn't necessary anymore." The transmission ended shortly after, and I could see the uncertainty spreading across the faces of every officer present in that command room. For the first time in living memory, our empire had been offered mercy by a species we had intended to conquer, and rather than accepting it gratefully, our leadership seemed determined to interpret it as an opportunity to save face instead. Over the following weeks, word of the failed invasion began spreading beyond our own military channels, reaching the various client species scattered across Karathi-controlled space. I had access to limited communications during this period, and even through those restricted channels, I could sense a shift happening across our empire, subtle at first, but growing steadily harder to ignore. Species who had served under Karathi rule for generations, who had long ago accepted their place beneath our authority, began asking quiet questions among themselves. How had a single human fleet action disabled half our vanguard without any casualties on either side? How had a technology capable of such precise control gone completely undetected by our own scientists and analysts? And most dangerously for our empire's stability, if humanity had shown restraint against us, what did that say about the true balance of power we had convinced ourselves we still held? I began receiving fragmented reports of unrest on several outer worlds, minor at first, workers refusing certain orders, local governors requesting clarification on policies they had followed, without question for decades. Nothing openly rebellious, not yet, but the kind of quiet hesitation that experienced officers like myself recognized as the earliest signs of something far larger beginning to take shape. Grand Marshal Vor, rather than addressing these concerns directly, chose instead to double down on our original strategy, ordering a second, larger fleet to be assembled for a renewed assault on human territory. This time, he insisted, we would send enough ships that no clever technology could possibly disable them all at once. I was asked to help coordinate intelligence gathering for this new offensive, and though I voiced my concerns privately to several trusted colleagues, none of us held enough authority to change the course already set in motion. During this preparation period, I managed to gain limited access to additional historical records humanity had allowed us to review as part of ongoing, if strained, diplomatic contact. What I found only deepened my growing unease. Humanity's military history stretched back thousands of years before they had even achieved basic space travel, filled with conflicts that had forced constant innovation in strategy, technology, and coordination. Where our empire had spent centuries refining a single successful approach against consistently weaker opponents, humanity had spent that same span of time being forced to adapt against opponents who matched their own cleverness and determination step for step. I began to understand with growing certainty that the 4% survival projection our analysts had originally calculated had been built on a fundamentally flawed assumption. We had measured humanity's strength using standards developed from conquering isolated, peaceful, or already weakened civilizations. We had never accounted for the possibility of an opponent whose entire history had been shaped by centuries of internal conflict, refining exactly the kind of adaptability and resilience that made overwhelming force far less effective than it had ever been against us before. As the Second Fleet neared completion, I submitted one final report to Grand Marshal Vor, urging him to reconsider the planned offensive and instead pursue the diplomatic terms General Cole had originally offered. I explained, as clearly and respectfully as I could, that we were not dealing with a species that had simply gotten lucky, but one that had spent its entire history preparing, in one form or another, for exactly this kind of confrontation. Grand Marshal Vor read my report in silence, then set it aside without comment, informing me only that the offensive would proceed as scheduled, and that questioning the Empire's judgment further would not be tolerated from an officer of my rank. I left that meeting understanding, with a heavy and undeniable certainty, that our Empire was about to make the same mistake a second time, only now on a far larger and more devastating scale. I did not know, in that moment, just how quickly the consequences of that decision would begin to unravel everything our empire had spent 1,000 years building. The Second Fleet launched 3 weeks later, nearly triple the size of the first, gathered from every corner of Karathi territory, in a display meant to erase any doubt about our empire's strength. I was assigned aboard the command vessel this time, not by choice, but because Grand Marshal Vor wanted every officer who had questioned the offensive present to witness what he was certain would be a decisive victory. What we found upon arrival at the border was not the quiet, undefended colony we had encountered before. Human ships, sleek and efficient, waited in a loose formation that seemed almost casual compared to our rigid, disciplined ranks. At the center of that formation, unmistakable even at a distance, was a vessel I recognized from earlier intelligence reports as General Cole's own command ship. Grand Marshal Vor ordered an immediate broadcast, demanding humanity stand down and accept the terms of surrender we had prepared in advance. The response came quickly, though not from General Cole herself this time. Instead, A calm male voice answered, identifying himself simply as Captain Owen Marsh, informing us that General Cole had authorized her officers to handle what he called routine border incidents without requiring her personal involvement. I remember the flicker of uncertainty that crossed Grand Marshal Vor's face at those words. Our entire strategy had been built around confronting General Cole directly, believing her presence was necessary to secure any meaningful victory. The casual dismissal in Captain Marsh's tone suggested something far more unsettling, that this engagement, however massive it appeared to us, barely registered as significant to the humans preparing to meet it. The battle, if it could even be called that, unfolded with the same eerie precision as before. Rather than a direct confrontation, human ships maneuvered in patterns that seemed to anticipate our formations before we had even fully committed to them. Communication between our vessels began fragmenting almost immediately, orders arriving late or not at all, coordination collapsing into confused, isolated pockets of ships attempting to function independently. I watched from the command bridge as ship after ship reported the same disabling patterns we had witnessed during the first engagement: weapons failing, engines redirected, entire crews left stranded and helpless, without a single life lost on either side. It became clear, with growing horror, that this was not an accident of technology we had simply failed to detect. This was a deliberate demonstration, a message crafted specifically to show us that even with 3 times the forces, the outcome would remain exactly the same. Grand Marshal Vor refused to accept defeat, even as our own command vessel began losing critical systems around us. He ordered increasingly desperate maneuvers, attempting to break through what he believed must be a weak point in the human formation. Each attempt ended the same way: our ships gently but firmly redirected away from any meaningful engagement, as though we were children being guided away from a dangerous edge, rather than enemy combatants being defeated in open conflict. It was during this chaos that Captain Marsh opened a direct channel to our bridge, his voice calm, despite the ongoing engagement around us. "This doesn't need to continue," he said simply. "General Cole's offer still stands. Withdraw, and we can start working toward an actual resolution." Grand Marshal Vor, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of undeniable defeat, demanded to know why humanity continued showing restraint when total victory was clearly within their grasp. Captain Marsh's response, when it came, carried none of the mockery I expected, only a quiet, almost weary honesty. "Because we're not interested in becoming what you are," he said. "We don't need to erase your empire to prove a point. We just need you to understand that the old way of doing things doesn't work on us. Once that lesson sticks, we can figure out how to actually coexist." I watched Grand Marshal Vor's expression shift from fury to something closer to genuine confusion, as though the concept of restrained, deliberate mercy from a superior military force was simply beyond his ability to process. For 1,000 years, our empire had operated under the belief that true strength meant total, uncompromising dominance. Humanity, it seemed, measured strength differently, valuing control and precision over unnecessary destruction, confidence over cruelty. Within another hour, our second fleet lay as helpless as the first had been, scattered and disabled without a single life lost, floating silently under the watchful presence of a species that had once again proven itself far beyond anything our empire had prepared for. Grand Marshal Vor, faced with undeniable and total defeat for a second time, finally agreed to open direct communication with General Cole herself. She appeared on our screen looking exactly as composed as she had during our very first encounter, the same plain office, the same quiet confidence that had unsettled me from the very beginning. She did not gloat over our second defeat, nor did she offer any harsh words about our stubborn refusal to accept her original terms. She simply looked at Grand Marshal Vor with an expression that, for the first time, I recognized clearly as disappointment rather than anger. "I told you restraint wasn't the same as weakness," she said quietly. "I'm still willing to talk, but I need you to understand something first. This isn't going to end differently no matter how many ships you send. You're not fighting a fleet. You're fighting a species that spent longer preparing for exactly this kind of conflict than your empire has even existed." Grand Marshal Vor, finally stripped of the arrogance that had guided our empire's decisions for generations, asked what she truly wanted from us. no longer bothering with formal titles or practiced diplomatic language. General Cole considered the question carefully before answering. I want you to stop assuming every species you meet is either a conqueror or a victim. There's another option. Neighbors. Equals. It's worked for us before, with other civilizations willing to actually try it. I'd rather build that with you than keep doing this every few weeks. Word of this second, even more decisive defeat spread across Karathi territory far faster than the first, and this time the quiet unrest I had noticed earlier erupted into something impossible to ignore. Client worlds that had remained loyal for generations began openly questioning Karathi authority, emboldened by the undeniable proof that our empire's strength had clear and exploitable limits. Some governors began reaching out independently to human diplomats, seeking their own separate agreements outside our empire's control. I was recalled to Karathi Command shortly after these events, summoned before the full council to give a first-hand account of everything I had witnessed. It was, I believed, meant to be a formal inquiry into the failures of our military leadership. Instead, I found myself standing before a council chamber filled with uncertainty and quiet fear, leaders who understood, perhaps for the first time in their long lives, that the empire they had built their entire existence around was no longer the unquestionable power it had once been. I spoke honestly about everything I had observed, from General Cole's calm dismissal of our initial threats, to the eerie precision of humanity's technology, to the deliberate restraint they had shown even when total victory was well within their grasp. I explained, as clearly as I could, that we were not simply facing a stronger military force, but an entirely different philosophy of power, one built on centuries of hard-earned wisdom rather than simple brute dominance. The council listened in uncomfortable silence, and when I finished, Grand Marshal Vor, visibly diminished from the confident officer I had once known, admitted, before the full assembly, that continued conflict with humanity would only lead to further, more devastating losses, both militarily and in terms of our empire's already crumbling authority over its own territories. It was in that moment, standing before a council forced to confront the collapse of 1,000 years of unquestioned power, that I finally understood the true weight of General Cole's simple, unassuming words from our very first encounter. "Is that all?" she had asked, and in doing so, had quietly begun dismantling an empire that had never once considered the possibility of an opponent who did not need to conquer in order to win. The council's decision to pursue formal peace talks did not come easily, nor did it come without resistance from officers who still believed our empire's honor demanded some final display of strength before accepting terms from a species we had once considered beneath us. I was surprised, and admittedly relieved, when I was chosen as part of the small delegation sent to negotiate directly with General Cole, given my earlier reports had proven far more accurate than anyone in command had initially wanted to believe. Our shuttle arrived at a modest human station near the border, far smaller and less imposing than any Karathi command post I had ever visited. There were no elaborate displays of military might, no rows of guards meant to intimidate visiting dignitaries. A single officer greeted our delegation at the entrance and led us calmly through quiet corridors toward a meeting room that felt, once again, almost disappointingly ordinary for a species that had just brought our empire to its knees twice without losing a single life. General Cole stood as we entered, offering the kind of polite greeting one might expect between long-standing colleagues rather than recent enemies. She gestured for us to sit, and once everyone had settled, she wasted no time on unnecessary formality, something I had come to expect from her by now. "I'm glad it didn't take a third fleet for us to get here," she said simply, glancing briefly toward Grand Marshal Vor, before returning her attention to the delegation as a whole. Grand Marshal Vor, humbled in a way I never imagined possible when I had first served under his command, acknowledged her words with a slow, respectful nod. He explained, with surprising honesty, that our empire had underestimated humanity twice, and that continuing to do so would only lead to further unnecessary conflict for both sides. General Cole listened patiently, occasionally glancing down at a small set of notes in front of her, before finally speaking again. "I don't want an empire that's afraid of us," she said. "Fear doesn't make good neighbors. It just delays the next conflict until someone forgets the lesson." She outlined her terms clearly, and without unnecessary complexity. A formal end to hostilities. A mutual agreement establishing clear, respected borders between our territories. An open channel for trade and communication, built on equal standing rather than dominance from either side. And perhaps most surprising of all, an offer to share select, non-military technologies that could improve life across both our civilizations, provided we were willing to do the same in return. I watched the reactions around our delegation carefully, expecting resistance to terms that offered us far more dignity than our failed offensives had earned. Instead, I saw something closer to quiet relief, the recognition that we had been given a genuine opportunity to move forward, rather than simply accepting a humiliating defeat. Before the formal signing began, General Cole asked to speak with me privately for a few moments, a request that surprised everyone in the room, myself included. She led me to a smaller adjoining office, considerably plainer even than the meeting room we had just left, and gestured for me to take a seat across from her desk. "You were the one flagging concerns before both attacks," she said, not as an accusation, but simply as an observation. "Your reports were accurate. I read through what our people intercepted." I admitted, somewhat cautiously, that my concerns had largely been ignored by my superiors until it was far too late to matter. General Cole nodded thoughtfully, as though this response confirmed something she had already suspected. "That's usually how it goes," she said. "The people paying attention rarely get listened to until things have already gone wrong. I'm glad you kept paying attention anyway." I asked her, finally allowing myself the question that had lingered since our very first encounter. Why she had responded to our original declaration of war with such calm indifference, rather than the fear or desperation we had expected from every other species we had approached in the same manner. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, because fear wouldn't have helped us, and pretending to be afraid wouldn't have stopped your empire from attacking anyway. "I'd rather show you exactly what we were capable of early, before things got so bad that neither of us could walk them back," I told her, honestly, that her simple response, "Is that all?" had unsettled our entire command structure more than any show of force ever could have. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile at that, though it carried none of the unsettling confidence I had witnessed during our very first meeting. "It wasn't meant as an insult," she said. "I just needed your people to understand, clearly and immediately, that threats weren't going to work on us." Sometimes the calmest response is the one that actually gets taken seriously. Before we returned to the main meeting room, I asked her one final question, curious about something that had troubled me since learning more about humanity's long, difficult history. I asked whether she believed conflicts like the one between our empires were simply an unavoidable part of any two civilizations meeting for the first time, destined to repeat themselves no matter how much either side hoped otherwise. General Cole shook her head slowly. "I don't think it has to be, but it takes both sides, being willing to actually listen once the fighting stops, not just accept quiet terms until they feel strong enough to try again. That's on your empire now, just as much as it's on us." We returned to the main room shortly after, where the formal peace agreement was finalized between our two civilizations, marking the official end of a conflict that had begun with nothing more than a single, unassuming question. Grand Marshal Vor signed the terms on behalf of the Karathi Empire, and General Cole signed on behalf of humanity, closing what would later be remembered across both our peoples as one of the shortest, strangest, and most consequential wars either civilization had ever fought. In the months that followed, I was assigned to help oversee the early stages of communication between our two governments, a role I approached with far more caution and humility than I had carried into my previous position. I studied humanity's history extensively during this time, gaining a far deeper understanding of exactly what General Cole had meant during our very first private conversation. Humanity had not simply gotten fortunate in their encounter with our empire. They had spent centuries preparing, through their own difficult and often painful history, for exactly the kind of overwhelming threat we had represented. Where our empire had grown accustomed to easy victories against isolated, unprepared civilizations, humanity had been shaped by generations of internal conflict, refining patience, restraint, and quiet, calculated strength, long before they ever encountered a threat large enough to properly test it. I often thought back to that very first transmission, Sujar Vok's proud, confident ultimatum, and General Cole's simple, almost bored response. Is that all? At the time, I had believed it was arrogance, perhaps even a fatal miscalculation on her part. I understood now that it had been something far different, a quiet, deliberate confidence, born from centuries of hard-earned wisdom, offered not as an insult, but as an honest, calm warning that our empire had simply refused to properly hear. As trade routes opened and cautious cooperation slowly began replacing the fear and uncertainty that had defined our first encounters, I found myself grateful, in a strange and unexpected way, for the lesson our empire had been given. We had approached humanity expecting another easy conquest to add to our long, unbroken history of dominance. Instead, we had been offered something far more valuable, though it had taken 2 humbling defeats before we were finally willing to accept it. A chance to grow beyond the assumptions that had guided our empire for 1,000 years, and to build something new alongside a species that had proven, calmly and decisively, that true strength was never about how much destruction you were capable of causing, but about how much restraint you were willing to show once that destruction was no longer necessary. I do not know what future conflicts our empire may face as we continue to expand our reach across the stars, but I know now, with absolute certainty, that whenever we encounter a new civilization for the first time, I will remember the lesson General Lena Cole taught us so clearly, so patiently, and so completely. Never mistake calm confidence for weakness, and never assume that just because an enemy has not yet shown you the full extent of their strength, it means they do not already understand it far better than you do.